Van Halen's Diver Down has been stirring up debate since the day it hit the record store shelves. If you've been following the band through the late 70s into the early 80s, the shift was impossible to miss. Fair Warning had barely settled before the group pivoted hard into something looser, lighter, depending on who you asked, either playful detour or this creative retreat. Some fans saw it as a real huge step backward, pull away from that grit and fire that they had honed on that earlier album. Others liked it. They saw it as this high-energy, no-frills party record, heavy on covers, light on fresh originals, but still packed with that unmistakable Van Halen attitude. Love it or hate it, one thing was certain. Diver Down crashed onto the scene in 1982 and left a mark loud enough for everybody to hear. Now, by the time Diver Down dropped, Van Halen wasn't just an American rock juggernaut. They were actually breaking through internationally, leaving this trail of wreckage in the form of sold-out arenas, backstage chaos, and all the fun that comes with being in a band like that. And by this time, the live shows were pure spectacle. Roth was this high-flying kung fu meets vaudeville, and of course Eddie was just scorching the earth with a guitar. The band had that unstoppable rhythm section with Michael Anthony and Alex Van Halen just totally laying it down. But behind the scenes, the cracks were definitely showing. There was a lot of tension that had been brewing with Ted Templeman, especially over the band's studio approach. But when Diver Down hit, none of that seemed to matter. That album shot right up the Billboard charts, sticking around for an impressive 65 weeks. For a record that barely passed the half-hour mark, it definitely packed enough to move over 4 million copies in the US alone. And the whole thing started almost by accident. After wrapping up the grueling Fair Warning tour in late 81, Van Halen was supposed to take a breather. And by this time, they had pretty much been locked in a relentless cycle since 1978. Album, tour, repeat, burning through materia and stamina at a breakneck pace. So the idea here was to finally slow down, maybe ease into writing a couple new songs without the usual pressure. But that plan did not stand a chance. David Lee Roth, never one to sit still, wasn't about to let Van Halen's name fade from the spotlight. So he pushed for a quick, stopgap single to keep the buzz going while they were figuring out what the hell their next move was going to be. And his first pick was actually a rock-infused take on Martha and the Vandellas Dancing in the Street. But Eddie was not feeling it. He wanted something fresh, a riff or a twist to make the cover worth doing. And try as he might, Dancing in the Street at that point just was not hitting the mark. So Eddie had a better idea. Why not take a swing at Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman instead? That one actually hit the sweet spot. So the band tore into Sunset Sound, knocked it out in a single day, and sent it straight into the wild. And it paid off fast. That single shot up to number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100, catching the label's attention in the worst way possible by making them want more. Suddenly, Van Halen, who were supposed to be on a break, definitely was not on that break anymore. Warner Brothers was like, hey, great job, guys. Okay, now give us a friggin' album to go with it. And before they knew it, Dave, Alex, Eddie, and Michael Anthony were right back in the trenches again, hammering out tracks with Ted Templeman, calling the shots. And the whole thing took about 12 actual days of studio time. Call it rushed or efficient, but Diver Down came together in a whirlwind, whether the band was actually ready for it or not. So Diver Down kicks off with Where Have All the Good Times Gone, which is another dip into the Kinks songbook. But this time with a notably lighter touch than pretty much anything that would have been on Fair Warning. Looking back, the dark, brooding guitar lines of Mean Street, well, they're nowhere to be found here. Instead, Van Halen sets that tone with more of a loose, bright energy. Definitely a sharp contrast to the grit that they've been dealing in just a year prior. And of course, since they already had You Really Got Me under their belt, this was just a natural progression for them, as they proved that they could twist mid-60s British rock into something louder, flashier, and definitely pure Van Halen. And by the time they tackled this tune, they had already had it down to a science. Eddie chucked in some cool little pick scrapes in there to add a bit of texture. And interestingly, critics would grumble about this one, saying it was a bit too faithful to the original. But Van Halen knew that they would always bring in tighter arrangements, more layered dynamics, and of course their individual playing styles and Roth's vocal style made it undeniably Van Halen. Next up, they kick in with Hang 'em High. And this track actually has deeper roots than most Van Halen fans had realized. It was actually a leftover from their club days, reworked into something a bit sharper and a bit meaner. And Roth, always one with a penchant for this cinematic spin, compared it to like an old western. The kind where the tension just hangs in the air right before the showdown in some dusty, god-forsaken frontier town. Eddie's solo on it, pure magic all the way. Those signature fiery pentatonics, and some killer two-hand tapping really make this one pop. But Eddie later admitted that he wasn't entirely happy with it. He kind of wished that he had tightened things up a bit more. But really, that barely contained recklessness that's exactly what makes Hang 'em High work. It's like this runaway train, a bit wild and unpredictable, and a perfect fit on any of their albums. And from there, the album takes a quick detour with a couple instrumentals. But what's interesting is it also served as a reminder that Eddie wasn't really just a pure shredder. He was always this full-on sonic magician, finding new ways to twist his guitar into something unexpected and fresh. One of those pieces, Cathedral, got its name because Eddie thought it sounded like a church organ. And again, through those Roth years, one big signature about every one of their albums was that there was always a centerpiece going on where Eddie was really able to stand out. And this one was no exception. Eddie took advantage of a Roland SDE 3000 delay pedal in order to get this immediate call and response with the guitar. It was set up with 100% depth, so that anytime you would hit a note, the delayed note would be every bit as loud as the note that you hit that caused the delay. And the real trick to it is to have it set up to dotted eighth notes. But nowadays, we could replicate that pretty easy with a digital delay where we could literally choose the dotted eighth note. Back then, he pretty much had to do it by feel. So anyways, you select the dotted eighth note, and then you start hitting the tap tempo, which this pedal actually has too. But you would tap that in quarter notes to exact pacing that you want. And then he would play quarter notes. But when he played quarter notes, the notes that were delayed would come back in a particular order and weave themselves perfectly in between the notes that he was playing. Add to that he was quick on the volume knob so that every single note that he would play would have a quick fade in, and voila, you had Cathedral. He played all sorts of cool arpeggiated shapes throughout, but this one really landed that nice digital delay effect. And to pull it off really easily, one could use a funky string muter down at the lower end of the fretboard, or tie a sock around it, or if you're clever like me, just get some hair ties from Claire's. Either way, by having those strings muted, one could just go ahead and do the hammer-ons and have their right hand ready to go on that volume knob without any open strings ringing out of place. The only problem is Eddie ran the risk of hosing the volume knob because he was really putting it through its paces. So he had to make sure to nail Cathedral in just a couple of takes. But the sound was so haunting and hypnotic that it made it a staple of his live solos, at least for a while. And then there's Intruder, a swirling, ominous piece of sonic weirdness that acts as the lead-in to Oh Pretty Woman. And the way it came out was pure Van Halen improv. They had done the music video for Oh Pretty Woman, which ran about 3 minutes too long. So instead of trimming down the video, Roth actually got on the synth and came up with that haunting line. Eddie added in some wild guitar scrapes for yet more texture, and Alex and Michael just held it down in the background. But it flowed perfectly right into the opening of Oh Pretty Woman. And the video itself, pure chaos. Michael Anthony dressed as a samurai, a couple of dwarves running around, a supposed damsel in distress who in reality was a well-known drag performer from the LA scene, and it scared the living crap out of MTV. They took one look at it and said, nope, this video's banned here. And a lot of it came down to the fact that they saw Michael Anthony as mocking a sacred warrior. And Roth and classic Van Halen just shrugged it off, calling it a surrealist art project that was never meant to be taken seriously. And a lot of diehard fans really weren't into the Pretty Woman cover. They just didn't see it as this kind of heavier edge of Van Halen. It felt like more like a throwaway than anything, or a novelty. But the numbers did not care. I mean, the song ended up taking off, and the label just saw dollar signs, so they were quite happy as well. And for it, Roth had leaned into that playful vibe, delivering that swaggering vocal while the rest of the band tightened it up with pounding drums and Eddie's razor-sharp guitar tone. But through this whole process, it was kind of like a circus for Eddie. He had later said that he'd rather bomb with his own music than score a massive hit with somebody else's song. But a hit is a hit, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Got the entire album into the public spotlight, whether the band liked it or not. So another cover, Dancing in the Street, was originally Dave's pick when he started. Eddie wasn't having it. But Templeman and the rest of the band weren't ready to scrap it just yet, eventually convincing Eddie to take a different approach. Instead of trying to force this guitar-heavy spin, he ended up building it around this layered, swirling synthesizer part. Now, the story has it, though, that Eddie had actually intended to come up with a whole different song for that. Ted Templeman heard it and was like, hey, this would totally work perfectly for Dancing in the Street. And what's interesting about the synth line is that it actually kind of ties in similarity-wise with the way he approached Cathedral, because it also had that delay going on. Only this one had multiple echoes on it, but it was all perfectly beat-matched. And Eddie would later admit that it took him a lot longer than he expected to arrange, but in the end, they laid it down. And of course, critics were saying, well, that's too close to the original. And of course, that actually only fueled Eddie's growing frustration in the studio. Between the constant push for covers and the creative tug-of-war with Templeman, the whole Diver Down process was really starting to wear Eddie thin. But the album took another unexpected turn with Secrets, which is this kind of mellow, pop-leaning track. It really stood out from Van Halen's usual high-octane stuff. And in its own way, it kind of sits along maybe their earlier Push Comes to Shove as one of those sort of standout tracks that's uncharacteristically mellow for that time. And what's interesting about this one is that Roth admitted that he had actually gotten lyrical inspiration from greeting cards, specifically Get Well cards that he had picked up in Albuquerque. A lot of people speculated that its softer musical touch kind of reflected Eddie's relationship with Valerie Bertinelli, who he had just hooked up with fairly recently. But what's also interesting is that this features Eddie on a Gibson double-neck 12-string. He nailed the solo in a single pass, no fuss, no second takes. A lot of people dismiss this one as one of their more lightweight tracks compared to the rest of the band's catalog, but it still had that breezy, effortless vibe that defined Diver Down's poppier moments. And then there's Little Guitars, which kicks off with the intro. Nice and short and sweet, intricate acoustic passage that hints more at Eddie's flamenco influences. And we heard that earlier on his amazing acoustic centerpiece, Spanish Fly, from the second album. And with this one, he didn't quite get as intricate necessarily, even though the chords themselves were pretty interesting. And for this one, he had taken inspiration from Spanish guitar maestro Carlos Montoya. But Eddie wasn't really a traditional finger picker, so he faked it using a pick to mimic those fast runs that Montoya would make look effortless. And when the full song kicks in, Eddie swaps to a miniature Les Paul he picked up from Nashville Luthier, turning it into a live show gimmick as much as a song. Now this one might not rank among Van Halen's all-time greatest compositions, but the sight of Eddie bouncing around on stage with that pint-sized guitar definitely made it a fan favorite. Now easily the quirkiest moment on Diver Down is Big Bad Bill is Sweet William Now. Full-blown 1920s throwback, complete with Eddie and Alex Van Halen's dad, Jan Van Halen, on clarinet. The whole thing started when Roth, fiddling with his Walkman, stumbled onto some oddball Louisville, Kentucky radio station playing ancient tunes. So he ended up picking on this old novelty track, bringing it to the group, and pretty much made them sit through it. They had a bit of a laugh, but before long it turned to, screw it, let's just give it a shot. So they dug up and dusted off the old sheet music, got Jan into the studio, even though he had not touched a clarinet in a decade after losing his left middle finger in an accident. But it didn't matter. They ran through it in a single session, capturing the kind of ragtime energy that felt more suited to a speakeasy than a rock album. The whole thing was played a bit tongue-in-cheek, but Roth swore that if you listened close, you could hear where Eddie and Alex got it from. That mix of humor, sharp technique, and just the right amount of booze-fueled swagger. And then there's the full bug, a phrase straight out of Dave's cucaracha-crushing playbook. According to him, if you really wanted to take out a roach cornered against the wall, you had to commit to it. Jam your foot in and make sure you stomp the whole thing. No half measures. That, in his mind, was a perfect metaphor for giving something your absolute complete all. And musically, the full bug is one of the heavier hitters on Diver Down, with Roth even busting out a harmonica in the intro. Eddie, always pulling inspiration from unexpected places, admitted some of the guitar parts were the result of messing around with Alan Holdsworth's style of phrasing. For fans who felt Diver Down leaned too far into glossy, cover-heavy territory, this track, along with Hang 'Em High, still showed that they still had it. And then, in classic Van Halen fashion, they closed the album with an absolutely bizarre note, Happy Trails. No instruments, no shredding, just the four of them in this barbershop quartet kind of style, complete with them cracking up at the very end. And it gave off that vibe like the kind of goofing off they did backstage, which according to Roth was definitely a regular thing. He was always throwing out random jingles and show tunes for fun. They've been singing dumb little commercial melodies for years, so why not slap one on an album? And it might seem like throwaway filler, but it sealed Diver Down's identity as Van Halen's most off-the-wall, unfiltered record, half rock album, half inside joke, and somehow totally them still. And critics had a field day with Diver Down's cover-heavy track list and unexpected detours. The August 1982 issue of Cream magazine ran a brutal takedown by Bruce Malamut, who didn't just dislike the album. He called it an absolute insult to fans, particularly the ones who forked over $10 or more for a record that barely stretched past 30 minutes. He did the math. 12 tracks, 5 covers, 3 instrumentals. That left just 4 original Van Halen songs. And in his eyes, that was just absolutely unexcusable. Malamut dragged Diver Down through the mud, comparing it to Todd Rundgren's Initiation, an album that crammed over an hour of music onto a single LP. But if Todd could do it, why couldn't Van Halen? He griped that Dancing in the Street, Where Have All the Good Times Gone, and Pretty Woman were just way too faithful to the originals, nothing unique or original at all. He also slammed Big Bad Bill as Sweet William Now as having pure campy period piece nonsense, and brushed off Happy Trails as a complete waste of space. As for the rest, he only had praise for Hang 'em High, calling it the one track that still had that raw, early Van Halen punch. But he wasn't done. He closed his review with a prediction. If Van Halen ended up on Cream's pages 2 years down the line, he would be shocked. He also compared them to Aerosmith's Downfall, suggesting that they were already heading down the same road. So he wasn't just unimpressed, he actually thought Diver Down was the beginning of the end. But from the fans' perspective, Diver Down was a dividing line, really. The guitar diehards who worship Fair Warning saw that album as Van Halen's creative peak. Dark, intricate, packed with Eddie's most inventive playing. So when Diver Down leaned hard into the pop covers, some of them felt like they had just been left in the dust. But then there were those who preferred their more lighter, party-hardy side, or just wanted more of a fun rock record. And Diver Down definitely delivered exactly that. And whether they're purists like or not, Pretty Woman cracked open the door to even more radio play. MTV just jumped on the singles, and at least the ones that didn't get banned. And suddenly Van Halen was reaching a broader audience. And then there's the sales factor. Diver Down ended up outselling Fair Warning, something that still irks a lot of fans who believe Fair Warning deserved way more attention, this one included. Some chalk it up to the MTV effect, others say it's just the universal appeal of the familiar covers. Either way, Diver Down won the numbers game. Eddie Van Halen, though, definitely not thrilled. He absolutely hated having so many covers on the album, feeling like it was just slapped together just to ride the wave of Oh Pretty Woman, instead of giving the band time to develop new material properly. Ted Templeman and the label didn't see a problem. Covers were instantly recognizable, much easier to push on the radio and guaranteed sales. When it came down to it, though, Eddie just wasn't happy with studio execs breathing down his neck. And that's why he built 5150, his own home studio. He saw Frank Zappa do it, and he really liked the level of creative control that Frank was enjoying. And this would ensure that next time around, Van Halen themselves would actually be in control. And the next time, 1984. A cleaner, more polished album that took Eddie's sound into new territory, especially with his keyboard work, which exploded with Jump. But the seeds of that shift had already been planted during Diver Down. Tracks like Dancing in the Street had Eddie layering in synth textures, foreshadowing where he was about to take the band's sound. Diver Down might have been more of a detour, but it definitely set the stage for the next evolution of Van Halen. And the album cover for Diver Down keeps things simple. A bold red and white Diver Down flag, the universal sign that a scuba diver is below the surface. But leave it up to David Lee Roth to spin some marketing out of it. He claimed the symbol represented something deeper happening beneath the surface, something that you couldn't catch at first glance. And meanwhile, the back cover tells a different story. A live shot from October 24th, 1981 at the Tangerine Bowl in Orlando, Florida, when Van Halen opened for the Stones. And that moment really captures the band at a high point, climbing towards superstardom, even if behind the scenes tensions were already starting to simmer then. Listening to Diver Down from front to back, it's clear that it's not a fully cohesive album. Definitely a mixed bag, but whether people loved it or hated it, the numbers didn't lie. Shot up to number 3 on the Billboard 200 and stayed there for 65 weeks. By 98, it had actually gone quadruple platinum. Definitely a big achievement for a 31-minute album, most of which they hadn't written. But it proved Van Halen's ability to pivot. Even if Eddie and Alex grumbled about being roped into a covers-heavy project, the result was anything but invisible to the rock world. This was that looser, freer version of Van Halen, one that wasn't really obsessed with perfection. And for some fans, it was kind of a refreshing after that real heavy energy of Fair Warning. But at the end of the day, Diver Down was a product of its time. The early 80s, MTV's explosion, label's hunger for recognizable hits, Dave's nonstop push to keep Van Halen in the spotlight, and Eddie's brewing desire to break away from industry constraints. And interestingly enough, too, it actually served as a gateway for a lot of new fans. Those who were pretty much glued to pop radio finally got their exposure to one of the greatest hard rock bands from the 70s, and now by this time early 80s. And so it really opened the floodgates and perfectly set the stage for their next album, 1984. One thing is for sure, though. Diver Down is about as unconventional as a multi-platinum rock record could ever get. So I've covered a whole hell of a lot of Van Halen, and I left the links below in the description where I covered Van Halen 1, Van Halen 2, Women and Children First, Fair Warning, and also 1984. And if that wasn't enough, I also did a 4-part series on the entire life and career of Eddie Van Halen. I guess you could say I have a bit of a Van Halen problem. I then decided to take a break in the action, so I did a deep dive on Dio's Holy Diver, and then that reminded me, oh yes, maybe I might want to go ahead and do the video for Diver Down as well. See how those things work out? It's just really interesting. Anyway, thanks to my subscribers. You are just so damn awesome. And if you haven't had the chance to subscribe yet, place your middle finger into your mouth, get a good sopping wet, and give that subscribe button a nice wet willy. And with whatever's left over, make sure you go ahead and give that like button a wet willy as well. And I want to thank you so much for watching.